Ahoy! Welcome to the Pirates of the West Indies. In this series, we're going to cover the history of the pirates in the Caribbean. We're going to cover the terror, the glory, and the height of their fame, seeking out treasure. We will dive into the reasons why pirates were so infamous in this new world of the Americas, answering the questions of who they were, where did they come from, and what was their mission? Treasure, of course. Looking deeper into these famous pirates, such as Blackbeard, Captain Morgan, and not as well-known names such as Captain Olanes. Their past is hidden away, locked in a chest, buried in Tortuga. Let's find the X on the treasure map, dig up some of these golden doubloons, discovering the history of pirates in the Caribbean. Hop aboard, and let's begin. The pirates in the Caribbean lived and occurred mostly in the mid-1600s. Yet, the story of how they began and where they come from begins with the Spanish. The Spanish Empire was one of the strongest empires at the time. They were one of the first European nations to set sail to the New World. Even having Christopher Columbus, who was Italian, did sail for the Spanish. Discovering the Caribbean, the Spanish set up shop in Havana and began to ship goods and resources back to the mainland. The most sought after of these goods, of course, were the Spanish golden doubloons, basically gold coins. The French and English wanted a piece of this action in the Caribbean and began to send their own ships and forces to colonize, find gold, and compete with the Spanish. War did not break out between these countries in the Caribbean because of an agreement that everything west of the Azores and north of the Capricorn, basically the Caribbean New World, was all fair game. It was no peace beyond the line west of Europe. The Spanish believed the Caribbean was not as profitable or fruitful as mainland Mesoamerica or South America. Most of the conquistadors began to move inland with the population, leaving behind the Caribbean islands, leaving a gap of people and soldiers in the Caribbean. The French and English, in order to establish a foothold in the Caribbean, took advantage of this. Establishing only a few colonies, the French and English approved sailors to aggravate the Spanish fleets and ports. This will play into how the French and English approved piracy in the name of the crown. But as time goes on, these pirates are called privateers. As time goes on, these very men that were approved by the crown become more lawless and more ruthless, which will pose a threat for all the empires in the Caribbean. So who were these pirates? Putting it into two categories. Here's the evolution of piracy from buccaneers, and then there's the men who engaged in piracy. We'll start with the men. There was a demand for workers in tobacco plantations that called for lower-class people in Europe to come to the New World. These people were ex-sailors, runaway indentured servants, or anyone in need of freedom. Indentured servants is close to slavery, forcing these men to work for horrendous wages. Swamped in debt and mistreatment from their overlord, these men began to flee and escape to the deserted island off the map. This is just one example of how many who left it all behind and ran for the hills. These people of French and English descent wound up on these islands surviving off the land. These men were called buccaneers, and the reason they were called this is from the Carib Indians, where the name Caribbeans come from, the first inhabitants of the Caribbean. When the Spanish came, they introduced the Columbian Exchange, which was the exchange of foods, disease, and other products. If the local Caribs survived rampant disease, typically the Spanish forced them into slavery or outright death. Moving back to these English and French runaways surviving on these off-the-map islands, these men would catch their prey, wild hogs or any animals they could find, and smoke them over a fire for a duration of time, hence giving the names buccaneer. I know we only thought of pirate, but they really had many different names. In the next episode, we'll examine all these different names. These bands of men began to live with one another and form groups. They actually began to develop a code, a pirate's code, outlining how they should act, what they could kill, steal, etc. The Spanish saw how dangerous these men living off the land could be. In response, they began to systematically destroy these wild herds, which forced these men to find a new way to live, causing them to turn to, you guessed it, piracy. These bands of men, armed with pistols, cutlass, and a musket, dug out condors or canoe-like ships and began to attack Spanish fleets and ports for reasons of greed, starvation, national identity, and revenge, using tactics of cruelty and fear to find victory. That's all the time I have today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this. This is James Fares, and this has been the introduction. Every week I'm going to come out with a brand new episode, so I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you thought about it. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next week on the Pirates of the West Indies.